There's a strange contradiction at the heart of modern civilization. We are a species that builds machines capable of simulating universes, decodes the behavior of subatomic particles, and sends robotic scouts billions of kilometers into interstellar darkness. Yet we still shudder at bedtime over a concept invented thousands of years ago: eternal damnation. We live in a world where artificial intelligence begins to approximate intuition, where telescopes peer into the birthplaces of stars, and quantum computing solves problems our ancestors could only call magic. But for many, the most terrifying concept isn't entropy, black holes, or even death. It's what happens after it. That despite a life of love, questions, and imperfection, we might be punished forever simply for not believing the right thing at the right time in the right building. That is a uniquely human paradox. For all our scientific progress, some chains still hold. But unlike chains of iron or steel, these are chains of belief woven through childhood stories, cultural programming, and inherited rituals so subtle we often don't know we're wearing them. This isn't an argument against faith. Let's be clear. Faith, at its most powerful, has lifted civilizations, comforted the grieving, and inspired the construction of cathedrals that make the soul tremble with awe. But when faith becomes fused with fear, when belief becomes a method of control rather than exploration, it ceases to elevate and begins to suffocate. That's not theology, that's psychology. And in psychology, when ideas are planted before critical thinking is developed, they become foundational beliefs, almost indistinguishable from instinct. If a child is taught that questioning spiritual authority leads to punishment, then curiosity becomes danger. Inquiry becomes guilt, and guilt, over time, becomes obedience. We call it reverence. But often, it's fear dressed in ceremonial robes. In astrophysics, there's a concept known as the event horizon, the boundary around a black hole beyond which no light can escape. But perhaps the mind has event horizons, two psychological points of no return, beyond which rational thought cannot reach if emotion is too deeply tethered. What happens to a mind raised on the image of a wrathful deity? One who watches every thought like surveillance footage from heaven. It doesn't become more moral, it becomes more afraid. And fear, ironically, is the enemy of growth. Just as plants recoil from cold, the human mind closes in the presence of punishment. We stop thinking expansively, we stop reaching out. And in that silence, control thrives. Religious conditioning, as Dolores Cannon and others have observed, was not always the architecture of fear. Long before hierarchies and holy wars, long before sin became a business and confession became a ritual of control, ancient spiritual systems held a very different view. The divine was not a judge, but a force, a field, a presence. And humanity was not separate from it, but immersed in it like waves within the ocean of consciousness. In those teachings, reincarnation was a given. Growth was continuous. Failure was not punished, but learned from. But over time, something changed. Dolores called it the fall, but not in the way most religions interpret it. It was not the fall of man from moral purity, but the fall of consciousness from cosmic unity into fragmentation. The moment when humanity, once tuned to the frequency of the universe, was interrupted by the static of control. Control, you see, is easier to maintain when people fear the unknown. And what better unknown than death? What greater leverage than eternity? Introduce the idea of hell not as metaphor, but as a literal torture chamber, and you've created the most powerful psychological weapon ever conceived. One that doesn't require walls or guards, just belief. But what if hell, as commonly taught, doesn't exist? Curiously, much of what people fear about the afterlife, particularly the concept of eternal damnation, doesn't originate from foundational religious tech, but rather from cultural overlays and mythologies adopted over centuries. If hell exists as a literal place, it's oddly absent from most of the core scriptures. One wonders, if such a place were central to our destiny, wouldn't it be more prominently featured? Much of the fiery underworld imagery comes from Nordic legend, not divine revelation. And yet, it shapes the emotional reality of millions. Let's pause on this point. If the creator of the universe is anything like the force that births galaxies, designs DNA, and sets in motion the laws of physics with unfathomable precision, then surely such a mind, such a heart, would not require suffering as payment for imperfection. Think of your own children. Would you throw them into fire for disobedience? Or would you teach, guide, and forgive? If we, flawed as we are, know how to love without eternal punishment, how could the source of all consciousness do less? The real tragedy is this. When people believe in a punishing afterlife, they begin to fear their own thoughts. They approach death not with dignity and peace, but with anxiety. Dolores Cannon's daughter, working in intensive care, saw it firsthand. People gripping their sheets in terror, convinced that any imperfection in their life meant hell awaited. This is not divine justice. This is psychological trauma, institutionalized and passed down like an heirloom. It's time we questioned it. And in doing so, we must remember, belief is not static. It evolves. And when it doesn't, it calcifies into dogma. When we stop challenging inherited thought, we stop growing. If we want to access what Dolores referred to as the fifth dimension, a higher frequency of consciousness, we must first shed the weight of low-frequency thinking. Fear, guilt, shame. These are anchors, not wings. We live in a universe composed of energy. Matter is energy condensed. Thought is energy directed. Every belief you hold is like a signal sent into the field of existence, shaping how you perceive, react, and live. Dolores often spoke of Earth as a training ground, a classroom. The laws of energy apply here too. If enough of us believe in suffering and hell and separation from divinity, we create a version of it here. Not through fire and brimstone, but through fear, division, and conflict. We manifest hell not as punishment from above, but as projection from within. But the reverse is also true. If we hold beliefs of love, unity, and compassion, we shape a different frequency. The fifth dimension is not a place. It's a state, a wavelength, and only a mind free from conditioning can tune into it. To do that, we must first become observers of our own belief systems. Ask, is this fear Minera? Was it inherited? Does this belief lift me or bind me? Was I taught to love the diviner to fear it? The answers don't arrive easily. They require reflection, courage, and sometimes letting go of stories we were told to never question. But in that questioning, something extraordinary happens. You begin to awaken not in the mystical sense, but in the neurological, psychological, and cosmic sense. Your brain begins to rewire. Your emotional state shifts. You no longer react out of guilt, but choose out of awareness. You reclaim authorship over your reality. That is freedom. That is consciousness. That is the beginning of stepping beyond the prison of old programming and walking eyes open, mind clear into the higher dimensions of being. But awakening is not always gentle. Often, it begins with discomfort, a sense that something doesn't quite fit, that the rules you were given to live by no longer explain the world you're experiencing, that the God you were taught to fear does not match the vastness and elegance of the cosmos you're now learning to understand. And so begins the quiet rebellion, not against tradition, but against limitation. This is the moment the mind, like a telescope newly focused, begins to see farther, begins to realize that what was presented as absolute might only have been partial, that what was labeled divine punishment might, in truth, have been cultural scaffolding tools for control masquerading as eternal truths. From a cosmological perspective, everything evolves. Stars are born, live, and die. Galaxies collide and reform. Even time itself is not absolute, but elastic. So why should belief systems made by humans, shaped by centuries, written in ink and translated through a Gendas, be immune to evolution? The truth is, they're not. They never were. But what has made them appear fixed is not their truth, but our fear. Fear of change, fear of exile, fear of the unknown. And yet, in science, the unknown is not feared, it is the frontier. The blank map waiting to be explored. Shouldn't our spiritual life be the same? The fifth dimension, as Dolores Cannon saw it, is not reserved for saints or mystics. It's accessible to anyone who dares to step beyond the walls of mental conditioning and peer into the architecture of their own soul. Think of it like a frequencia broadcast of higher consciousness available to all, but only received by those whose internal instruments have been tuned, and tuning requires intention, it requires effort. It requires the courage to disassemble the receiver you were handed and rebuild it based on what resonates with truth, not fear, not authority, but experience, lived, felt, and questioned experience. There is a reason we revere astronauts and physicists. They challenge boundaries. They go where others don't dare. But how often do we treat our inner space with the same reverence? We chart the heavens but neglect the subconscious. We launch rovers to Mars but avoid descending into the caverns of our inherited beliefs. And yet, that inner space, that psychological terrain, is where liberation begins, not with new doctrine, but with new awareness. Not by memorizing different rules, but by asking different questions. What if the divine is not above us, but within us? What if salvation is not about rescue, but about remembering? What if the soul is not judged, but learning? These are not radical questions. They are natural ones born from a mind that observes the elegance of the universe and suspects that its creator is not a tyrant, but a teacher. In the language of stars, there is no shame. There is fusion, expansion, collapse, rebirth, no guilt, just process, motion, transformation. So why have we accepted a framework where the soul is treated like property bartered, threatened, bought through obedience? Because fear works. Fear is effective. But fear is also primitive. And humanity, if it is to evolve spiritually, socially, cosmically, must grow beyond primitive tools of control. The real divine intelligence would not require your fear to prove your loyalty. It would not demand uniformity to express unity. It would not threaten you to teach you. It would illuminate you through insight, through reflection, through curiosity. Now pause, not with emotion, but with reason. The same reason you use to understand gravity, relativity, and molecular biology. Apply it to your spiritual beliefs. Would the architect of DNA so intricate that it encodes the entire blueprint of a human being resort to eternal torture as a behavioral correction tool? Would the source of all galaxies, each containing hundreds of billions of stars, care if you missed a ritual, misinterpreted a verse, or were born into the wrong tradition? This isn't a rejection of reverence. It's a shift from reverence as blind submission to reverence as understanding. When we comprehend the laws that govern the cosmos, awe emerges not from fear, but from the elegance of the equations themselves. Reverence as awe, sparked not by fear, but by understanding. That's what science and spirit can do when allowed to dance together. Produce a humility grounded in knowledge and a curiosity fueled by wonder. It's no longer about do as you're told, but understand what you are. You are not a mistake. You are not an exile from Eden. You are consciousness localized in flesh, looking outward at stars and inward at eternity. So if religious conditioning has told you otherwise, has made you feel unworthy, guilty by nature, born broken, then it's time to re-examine the code you're running. Because if there is a higher state of awareness to be reached, whatever we may call it likely requires a mind capable of thinking freely, unburdened by unnecessary guilt. And perhaps, in a metaphorical sense, it's like tuning a radio. Only when the signal is clear can you receive the message. A frequency of clarity, intention, and self-responsibility. And that is what Dolores Cannon was truly teaching, not an escape from religion, but an expansion beyond it, beyond the scaffolding of symbols and into the architecture of direct awareness, where belief is no longer handed to you, but sculpted through conscious inquiry. To reach that state, you don't need to abandon your roots, you need only examine them, gently, thoughtfully, courageously. What stories shaped your view of life, death, and divinity? Who wrote them? Why were they passed down? What did they fear? What were they trying to protect? And are those fears still relevant now in this world of telescopes, microscopes, and consciousness studies? Are those boundaries still necessary, or are they the remnants of an earlier aeon we can now transcend? This is the work, the inner revolution, not against God, but against the conditioning that distorts our view of God, not against tradition, but against the paralysis of unquestioned tradition. Because when we clear the fog of inherited fear, something extraordinary happens. We begin to feel, for the first time, the full magnitude of what it means to be alive. Not just to survive, obey, or conform, but to know, to choose, to create. And that is where the fifth dimension begins. If you've ever stared up at the night sky and felt something stir, something wordless, something ancient, it wasn't your imagination. That feeling, that pull is not theology, it's gravity. Not physical gravity, but spiritual gravity. The call of your own consciousness reaching out toward the stars that birthed it. And it is precisely this sensation, this yearning to remember our origins, that religious conditioning so often dulls, replaces, or redirects. It tells you to look upward, but not inward, to worship creation, but not question the creators of its doctrines. And yet, every atom in your body was forged in the heart of a dying star. Every breath you take is evidence of your participation in the universe's unfolding. You are not separate. You are not waiting to be worthy. You are the cosmos becoming aware of itself, one thought at a time. When Dolores Cannon explored past life regressions, what she uncovered wasn't fantasy. It was pattern. Over and over, individuals from different backgrounds, different cultures, even different continents describe similar visions dimensions beyond this one. Energies that transcend the physical, memories not stored in the brain but imprinted in the soul. These weren't hallucinations. They were echo S-signals breaking through the static of mental programming. And what stood in the way of their clarity, more than anything else, was fear. Not instinctive fear, not biological fear, but doctrinal fear. The fear that asking the wrong question might offend a being that created the entire electromagnetic spectrum, yet remains insecure about being questioned. This is where science and spirituality must meet, not in opposition, but in maturity. Science asks how, spirituality asks why, but fear stops both questions before they begin. It says, do not ask, do not wonder, accept, obey. And yet, the entire history of discovery, from Galileo to Einstein, from the Hubble telescope to the Hadron Collider, has been built on the refusal to stop at obedience, the refusal to bow before boundaries, the refusal to silence curiosity. So why, in matters of the soul, do we still cling to systems that punish the very instincts that make us human? This isn't just a philosophical issue, it's neurological. When you are conditioned from a young age to associate questions with shame, your brain wires itself for suppression. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of decision-making, learns to inhibit certain pathways. Over time, belief hardens. Not because it is true, but because deviation has been emotionally penalized for so long that the mind begins to prefer the comfort of chains over the risk of freedom. That is not faith. That is trauma dressed in spiritual language. And trauma, as we know from psychology, doesn't disappear with age. It embeds. It manifests in the form of anxiety, self-doubt, moral confusion. It shapes the way you make choices, the way you treat others, the way you view your own worth. Religious trauma is not always visible, but its signatures are everywhere, in the voice that whispers, "You're not good enough," in the reflex that feels guilt before joy, in the fear of death that creeps in even after a life lived well. These are not natural states. They are learned, which means they can be unlearned. And that unlearning, that deconditioning, is the path to the fifth dimension. Let's be clear. The fifth dimension is not a place. It's not a cloud, a throne, or a golden gate. It's a level of consciousness, a mode of perception, a vibration in which the self is no longer at war with itself, where duality begins to dissolve, where the sacred is no longer something external, but something you carry. In science, we talk about phase transitions, the shift from solid to liquid to gas to plasma. Consciousness, too, has phases. Most humans live in the solid, phase-rigid, structured, rule-bound. The fifth dimension is plasma fluid, luminous, transformative. And to reach it, you don't ascend physically. You expand internally. You rewire, you reframe, you release. But release is not abandonment. It is integration. You don't need to burn your books or renounce your heritage. You need only ask, what was I taught to fear and why? What was I warned never to question? What part of myself have I been made to silence in order to be acceptable? These questions are not heretical. They are essential, because any system that cannot survive a question is not a system of truth. It is a system of control. And real truth invites questions, thrives on them, evolves because of them. There is a universe inside you, vast and waiting. Neuroscience is beginning to reveal what mystics have always suspected, that the mind is not just a byproduct of the brain, but a participant in a deeper field. Call it consciousness. Call it soul. Call it zero-point energy. The name doesn't matter. What matters is that it exists and that it responds not to fear, but to clarity. Not to punishment, but to purpose. The moment you stop living out of fear of damnation and begin living from a sense of conscious participation in creation, you shift, you change frequency. You tune into a different band of reality. That's what Dolores Cannon meant by the fifth dimension. Not some unreachable utopia, but a different interface with reality, a different lens, a different bandwidth. And the static that blocks that signal, it's fear, guilt, shame, all programmed responses from outdated spiritual software. And so we arrive at a strange and beautiful crossroad where science and soul meet, not in conflict, but in clarity. Science tells us the universe is expanding. So should you. Science tells us every atom in your body is borrowed from the stars. So remember your origin. Religion told you what to believe, but the stars invite you to discover. Religion said salvation is earned through obedience. But the universe whispers, salvation is remembering who you already are. You're not inherently broken. Like any system operating in a vast and complex universe, you may simply be out of tune with the deeper harmonics of nature patterns we are only beginning to observe through the lens of science and consciousness. You are not fallen, you are rising, but rising requires friction. Evolution is never comfortable. In physics, a system only moves to a higher energy state when an external force is applied. In consciousness, that force is usually a question, a crack in the surface of certainty, a moment that makes you stop and wonder, what if what I've been told all my life isn't the whole story? That question is the beginning of liberation. And yet, in many religious systems, it is also the beginning of punishment. Doubt is cast as weakness, curiosity as rebellion. But let's reframe it through the lens of science. In science, doubt is not weakness. It is rigor. It is the quality that separates belief from knowledge. Without doubt, we would never question the Earth's flatness, the sun's orbit, the origin of disease, or the fabric of space-time. Without doubt, we remain children obedient, trusting, and endlessly vulnerable to the control of those who claim to have answers. So let's talk about control, not in the conspiratorial sense, but in the observable sociological one. Throughout history, institutions that seek control have always worked in tandem with narratives of fear. Whether it's fear of an external enemy or fear of internal damnation, the result is the same: compliance. People follow rules not because they understand them, but because they are afraid not to. And once that fear is internalized, once the guard lives inside your own mind, you no longer need to be watched. You self-police, you self-silence. That is the brilliance of religious conditioning. It is not maintained through chains, but through stories. Stories you were too young to question. Stories told with enough repetition that they become indistinguishable from reality. But here's where things get interesting. In neuroscience, we've discovered the brain's remarkable capacity for neuroplasticity. That means beliefs can change, habits can rewire, and identities can be rebuilt. You are not locked into the belief system you were born into. You are not doomed to live in fear because someone centuries ago declared it necessary for salvation. The architecture of your mind is flexible. You can unlearn what you were programmed to believe. And in that unlearning, something beautiful happens. You begin to feel again, not just the guilt and obligation that accompanied religion's rules, but the raw, vast, humbling wonder of existence. You begin to see yourself not as a being judged from above, but as a participant in a cosmic process-conscious part of a much larger unfolding. And that shift from being a servant of belief to a steward of awareness is what changes everything. Because once you see yourself as consciousness, you stop fearing your thoughts. Once you see yourself as energy, you stop fearing your mistakes. And once you understand that divinity is not outside of you, but expressed through you, you stop fearing your own power. Dolores Cannon often emphasized this point, that we are not merely physical beings with souls, but eternal souls temporarily having a physical experience. That insight alone reframes the narrative entirely. You are not climbing a ladder to earn divine approval. You are remembering your place in an already divine design. The fifth dimension does not ask you to become perfect. It asks you to become aware, to become responsible for the energy you carry, the thoughts you amplify, and the intentions you hold. In quantum physics, observation changes outcome. That means consciousness doesn't just perceive reality, it participates in its unfolding. So ask yourself, what are you participating in? Are you building a world based on fear, exclusion, hierarchy, and guilt? Or are you contributing to a reality shaped by love, curiosity, inclusion, and clarity? Make no mistake, this is not just about personal peace. It is about planetary evolution. If enough minds remain bound by fear, they will recreate systems that reinforce it. But if enough minds wake up, if enough people step beyond the programming and begin to think, feel, and act from a place of conscious alignment, then the very frequency of the planet shifts. This is not mysticism. It is resonance. It is systems theory. When the energy in a system reaches a tipping point, the system itself must reconfigure. We've seen it before in social justice movements, in scientific revolutions, in artistic renaissances. A few brave minds willing to defy the dominant story awaken others. The new story spreads. The paradigm cracks. And then almost overnight, the impossible becomes the new normal. This moment right now may be another such tipping point. A moment when millions are quietly questioning what they were once told to never doubt. When science and spirituality, long estranged, begin speaking again, not in rivalry, but in harmony. And when the voice inside you that always whispered, "There's more," finally speaks loud enough to override the static of fear. But the choice remains yours. You can cling to the stories that kept you safe in childhood, or you can step into the unknown terrain of your own awareness. One path offers certainty. The other offers truth. One keeps you comfortable. The other makes you free. The fifth dimension will not arrive by ritual. It will not appear through performance. It will not be granted by clergy, guru, or text. It will reveal itself the moment you begin to see through the illusion of separation and remember that the divine is not something you visit, it is something you are. So what happens when you stop fearing judgment and start seeking understanding? What happens when the idea of sin is replaced by the idea of feedback? When guilt dissolves into growth and shame is transmuted into self-awareness? What happens is simple. You rise, not above others, not into moral superiority, but into a frequency of peace. A peace not given to you by a deity pleased with your compliance, but a peace that emerges when the internal war between who you are and what you were told to be finally ends. Imagine a society made up of individuals who no longer live in reaction to inherited guilt, who do not serve out of fear, but act out of alignment, who no longer divide the sacred from the self, the divine from the daily. Imagine education that fosters curiosity, not conformity. Spiritual practice rooted in direct experience, not dogma. Leadership that invites exploration, not obedience. That world is not a fantasy. It is an emerging probability. And probabilities, as any physicist knows, collapse into reality through action. You see, the fifth dimension is not the reward for the righteous. It is the natural consequence of conscious living. It is the echo of thoughts uncluttered by superstition. It is the vibrational field generated when enough people step out of fear and into awareness. And you, yes, you are a part of that field. Every time you choose love over guilt, curiosity over certainty, reflection over reaction, you add to the charge, you strengthen the signal. This isn't about rejecting religion. It's about reclaiming the original essence behind all spiritual systems, the direct relationship between consciousness and creation. The truth is, many ancient mystics already saw this. Long before dogma, there was pattern. Before doctrine, there was energy. And before fear, there was awe. The awe that comes not from hearing someone tell you about God, but from looking up at the night sky and remembering that the same atoms in your hand are also burning inside the stars. That same awed bridge between science and spiritus, what religious conditioning tried to replace with hierarchy and control. But the awe never left. It's still there, under the stories, beneath the shame. It's there in the silence between your thoughts, in the stillness of a sunrise, in the symmetry of a snowflake, in the moment you breathe deeply and ask, what if everything I need to know is already encoded in the very fabric of my being? That question is the threshold. And once you cross it, you begin to see what Dolores Cannon and so many others were pointing to, not a place, but a state. Not a belief, but a remembrance. Not a commandment, but a frequency. You begin to feel that the divine is not watching you from above, but rising within you, responding to your every choice with elegant neutrality. Not judging, but reflecting. Not punishing, but presenting. The question then becomes, what are you choosing to reflect? What are you choosing to believe? And more importantly, who benefits from your fear? If the answer is not your own soul, then perhaps it's time to rewrite the code. You were never meant to fear eternity. You were meant to explore it. Not crawl before the divine, but walk beside Ida's co-creator, as participant, as spark. The fifth dimension awaits not with gates, not with tests, not with dogma, but with vibration. It asks no credentials. It grants no titles. It simply requires resonance. So rise, not in protest, but in presence. Not in defiance, but in awareness. Release the stories that no longer serve. Question the rules that shrink your light. And above all, trust the compass within you, the one that is always whispered beneath the noise. You are more than what they told you. You are not here to obey. You are here to remember. This is not the end. This is a beginning, a return to the cosmic identity that was never lost, only buried, and now uncovered. Not through ritual, not through suffering, but through clarity. So as you walk forward from this moment, ask not, what should I believe? But instead, what is true when I am most awake, most still, most unafraid? That is where the fifth dimension lives. Not in heaven, not in scripture, but in you, right here, right now, and it has been waiting for you to wake up.